deep within the dense, mist-covered expanse of the Appalachian Mountains.
A stark, silent landscape of jagged peaks blocking the sky.
Local folklore marks a specific pocket of this wilderness as Hungry Ridge, a settlement systematically erased from every modern map.
No one hunts there. No one ventures near the rotting
timber structures that sink slowly into the black soil. The region is a graveyard of memories,
avoided by those who know the terrain. After sunset,
the mere mention of the name is considered an invitation to misfortune. The wind here does not whistle. It drags against the rocks,
carrying the scent of damp earth and something older.
Something that has never left. It is not just an abandoned site. It is a place that rejects the living.
For decades, the ridge has waited, hidden behind layers of fog and local terror,
keeping its secrets buried deep beneath the roots, untouchable and entirely hungry.
5 strangers sat around a table in a cramped apartment, their eyes fixed on a single piece of paper. It was a U.S. Geological Survey map from 1954, its edges frayed, the paper yellowed by time. A faint, red ink mark circled a cluster of ridges that were blank on every modern digital satellite feed.
While locals in the nearby town had refused to look at the map, spitting on the ground at the mere mention of the coordinates,
the group saw only a prize. They checked their high-end cameras, adjusted their packs, and laughed off the warnings as nothing more than tired, mountain-grown superstition.
They were fueled by a hunger for fame, convinced they were the first to peel back the curtain on a ghost story. By dawn, they were parked at the base of a forgotten logging road, the dense forest looming ahead like a wall. They stepped out of the vehicle and moved toward the tree line with purpose. They were not looking for danger. They were looking for content.
They ignored the way the birds fell silent as they crossed the first boundary of the ridge, their boots crunching into the dry,
gray needles of the forest floor, stepping deeper into the trap they had meticulously mapped out for themselves. The logging road vanished within the first mile, replaced by a wall of thorns and ancient, tangled briars. For 6 hours, they climbed. The ground was treacherous, a loose skin of shale over slick, black mud that gave way under every heavy step. Muscles burned as they hauled themselves up slopes so steep they had to dig fingers into the damp earth just to keep from sliding backward.
The air grew thinner, colder, and heavy with the smell of rotted pine. 3 of them fell behind,
their breathing ragged, but the lead scout pushed forward, eyes scanning the horizon for a break in the trees. The forest seemed to lean in, branches locking together to block the sun, creating a tunnel of bruised light. Then, the incline leveled out. The mist, which had been a constant, suffocating shroud, suddenly parted like a curtain pulled by an unseen hand. Ahead, the forest floor opened into a jagged clearing. The settlement of Hungry Ridge stood in the center, a collection of sagging, gray cabins that looked as if they were melting into the earth. A collapsed mine shaft yawned at the base of the hill, its black mouth wide and silent. They had arrived. There was no turning back.
The front door of the largest cabin groaned on rusted hinges, protesting as they pushed it inward.
They stepped across the threshold, their boots scuffing on floorboards buried under decades of gray.
Undisturbed dust. The air inside did not smell of rot. It smelled of nothing at all,
as if the oxygen itself had been drained away. On a wooden table, a row of small, hand-carved dolls sat in a precise line, their painted eyes staring toward the door.
One explorer reached out to touch a toy, but pulled his hand back, unsettled by the lack of decay on the wood.
He tapped his foot against the floor, waiting for an echo, but the sound died instantly.
Absorbed by the walls like water into sand, they moved deeper into the dwelling,
searching for signs of life, but found only the heavy, oppressive weight of a time capsule that refused to age.
Every movement they made felt like a violation of a sacred, silent pact. They began to speak in whispers, but even those seemed too loud, grating against the thick,
unnatural quiet that filled every corner of the room. The house was not just abandoned, it was waiting.
They pushed into the kitchen, a cramped space where the shadow seemed deeper than the rest of the cabin.
The center of the rough-hewn dining table held a single ceramic plate. It was not empty. A thick, brown stew sat in the bowl, swirling with visible heat. Steam rose in thin, lazy ribbons,
curling toward the ceiling and vanishing before it reached the rafters. The smell hit them instantly, a rich,
savory scent of roasted meat and herbs that defied the stale, stagnant air of the room. One of the explorers stepped forward, his hand trembling as he hovered his palm over the rim. The heat was real. It radiated from the bowl, stinging his skin with a warmth that felt fresh and alive.
He looked at the floorboards, searching for footprints, but the dust remained pristine.
An unbroken gray sheet covering every inch of the wood. There were no chairs pulled out, no utensils laid,
and no sign of human presence. The bowl hummed with a quiet, persistent energy. They stood in a tight circle,
eyes wide, the sudden intrusion of domestic comfort in this rotting tomb, triggering a primal,
jagged fear. They were not alone in the house. The meal was still waiting for someone to eat.
They retreated from the cabin, stumbling into the tall, dead grass of the yard, as the last of the sunlight bled out of the sky.
The transition was violent. One moment, the horizon held a bruised purple glow.
And the next, the mountains were black silhouettes against a starless void. The temperature plummeted.
A sharp, icy draft sweeping through the clearing that turned their breath into white mist.
They scrambled to set up their tent, their fingers stiff and clumsy against the tent poles.
One explorer clicked on his high-powered lantern, but the beam sputtered and dimmed, casting only a weak,
sickly yellow circle that barely reached the edge of the camp. They zipped the tent shut,
the thin nylon fabric feeling like a translucent barrier against the weight of the forest. Outside, the trees had stopped moving.
The wind had died, replaced by a heavy, pressurized silence that seemed to vibrate against the tent walls.
They sat in the dark, huddled together, listening to the wood groan under the sudden, biting frost. The confidence they brought from the city had evaporated, replaced by the primal,
gut-level knowledge that something was watching them from the perimeter, waiting for the fire to go cold. The silence inside the cabin was shredded by a wet, rhythmic sound. It came from just beyond the exterior wall,
near the foundation. It was the sound of heavy, deliberate chewing, a wet,
tearing noise that echoed through the thin wooden planks. The explorers froze. One of them held up a digital recorder,
his knuckles white against the casing, aiming the microphone toward the source. The chewing continued, slow and methodical, as if something were breaking down thick, fibrous material. They watched the wall, expecting to see a shadow or a silhouette against the moonlight, but there was nothing. Another explorer raised a camera, flicking the lens to infrared. The screen glowed a harsh, monochromatic green, revealing only the rotting timber of the cabin exterior and the dark, empty forest beyond. The camera captured the sound perfectly, but the frame remained void of life. The chewing stopped for a heartbeat, followed by a faint, wet gulp that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards under their feet. Then, the rhythmic tearing resumed. They did not move. They did not speak. Every gaze was locked on the wall,
waiting for a face or a hand to break the surface, but the darkness outside remained absolute and undisturbed.
The morning light brought no relief, only a sharper view of the void. The campfire had burned down to a pile of gray ash,
cold and lifeless. Beside the embers, a backpack sat upright, neatly folded as if placed by a careful hand. It was untouched, yet the person who had worn it the night before was nowhere to be found.
No one had heard a sound during the night. No struggle had disturbed the perimeter.
One of the explorers knelt by the edge of the clearing, his finger tracing a line in the damp, dark soil.
A single set of muddy footprints led straight into the thicket of trees. He followed the trail with his gaze, then stiffened.
A second set of prints emerged from the tree line, moving in the opposite direction, returning to the camp alone.
The mud in those prints was fresh, still glistening with moisture.
The 4 remaining explorers stood in a tight circle, their eyes darting between the empty woods and the abandoned gear.
There was no blood on the grass, no broken branches, no call for help.
Only the silence of the valley and the impossible evidence of a visitor who had arrived and departed, leaving their companion behind. They packed their gear in frantic, jagged movements, the reality of the situation taking hold with each passing second.
The valley floor sloped downward, pulling them into a tangle of growth where the sunlight failed to reach. They moved in single file, hacking through ferns that stood waist-high and slick with dew. The air grew heavy, smelling of crushed pine needles and damp earth. Without warning, the path ended against a wall of thorns.
It was a barrier of briars, woven so tightly that not even a bird could pass through.
One of the explorers reached out to push the branches aside, but the thorns were jagged, snagging his skin. He pulled back, his hand bleeding, and pointed to a faint, gray outline behind the thicket.
It was a structure, long forgotten by the elements. They spent 10 minutes tearing at the briars,
their movements desperate and hurried, until a clearing opened. A windowless church stood in the center of the hollow. It was built from dark, weathered hemlock, the wood turned silver by age and rot. There was no door, only a jagged hole in the frame where the entrance had once been.
The structure did not lean. It seemed to be anchored into the very roots of the mountain. They stepped closer, the temperature dropping sharply as they reached the threshold, the silence around them deepening into a heavy, suffocating pressure. They stepped into the darkness, the floorboards groaning under their weight. Inside, the air was stagnant,
thick with the scent of dry rot and ancient dust. One explorer raised a flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal the interior walls. They were not bare. Every square inch of the aged hemlock was covered in names, thousands of them, carved deep into the wood with varying levels of precision. Some were faded, nearly worn smooth by the passage of time. Others were sharp, biting into the timber as if marked yesterday. They spread out, tracing the vertical columns of text with trembling fingers. The sheer volume of the list was overwhelming, a sprawling record of people who had once stood exactly where they were now. Then, the light hit the bottom row near the foundation. The wood here was different,
lighter in color, the fibers torn and raw. One of the explorers dropped his flashlight. He pointed at the wall, his breath hitching in his chest. There, carved in clear, deliberate strokes, were their own names. Beside them, the wood was still splintered, the shavings scattered on the floor beneath the carving. They were not discoverers. They were part of a catalog that had been written long before they ever arrived.
Beside the altar, a leather-bound volume lay open, its pages stained by moisture and time.
One explorer picked it up, the binding cracking as he flipped to the final entry. The ink was faded, yet the handwriting remained precise. He began to read aloud, his voice flat and monotone in the stagnant air. The entries spanned 2 centuries, detailing a winter of absolute starvation that had gripped the mountain.
To survive, the original settlers had made a bargain with a presence beneath the roots.
It offered food that never spoiled, and warmth that never faded. In return, the settlers promised a recurring harvest. The town was never abandoned. It was a larder, maintained for the entity to consume at its leisure. Every name on the walls represented a visitor who had wandered into the valley, lured by the geography,
and subsequently claimed. The final lines were dated only hours ago. It described their arrival, the exact number of them, and the specific time they would reach the church. The journal clicked shut.
They were not explorers documenting a myth. They were the next cycle of the larder, delivered exactly as the pact required.
The silence in the church shifted, feeling less like emptiness and more like an appetite. The heavy silence broke. It started as a low-frequency hum vibrating through the floorboards, rattling the loose stones near the altar. One explorer threw the journal aside, the leather cover slapping against the wood. He hit the church door, his shoulder slamming into the frame as he shoved it open. The rest scrambled behind him, tripping over their own feet in the rush to reach the sunlight.
Outside, the forest looked different. The trees seemed closer,
their branches woven into a tighter barrier than before. They did not look back. They ran blindly, boots tearing through thick briar and sliding on loose shale. Every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep directly behind them. They reached the edge of the clearing, their lungs burning. But the path they had taken was gone, replaced by a wall of impenetrable gray mist. They turned in a circle, gasping for air, searching for any break in the tree line. The town was not a ruin. It was a trap, and the trap was closing. They broke into a dead sprint toward the mountain slope, driven by the primal urge to outrun the hunger that now pulsed through the very soil beneath their feet.
They stopped dead. The sound did not come from behind them, but from the trees themselves. A voice,
clear and sharp, cut through the rustle of the leaves. It was a mother's voice,
calling a name that had been buried in a grave 3 years ago. The group froze, their chest heaving, faces pale. They looked at each other, eyes wide, searching for the source. Then came another.
A brother, a partner, a friend. Each voice spoke with an intimacy that felt like a physical touch.
The tone was perfect, lacking the hollow echo of a recording, carrying the exact cadence of memories they had long protected.
One explorer dropped his pack, his hands trembling as he reached toward the darkness.
He took a step forward, his boot sinking into the soft moss. His companions shouted,
but the sound of his own name drowned them out. The forest seemed to lean in,
the branches parting slightly to reveal only deeper gloom. The voices overlapped now,
a chorus of ghosts pulling at their sanity. They were no longer running from a predator. They were being beckoned by their own history.
Their resolve fracturing under the weight of impossible, desperate hope. The first explorer did not look back. He walked into the thicket, his movements rhythmic and steady.
He reached the tree line, his hand brushing against a low-hanging branch, and then he was simply gone.
No scream, no rustle of leaves. The space he occupied became empty in a blink. The remaining three stood paralyzed. A second voice, this one familiar and sharp, called from the left. Another explorer turned.
His eyes glazed, and moved toward the sound with a rigid, unnatural gait.
He stepped behind a cluster of hemlocks and vanished. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth.
The third explorer backed away, his heels catching on a protruding root, but he did not fall. He stood frozen as the shadows elongated, wrapping around his legs like thin, dark ribbons. He opened his mouth to shout,
but only a dry rasp emerged. He walked forward, pulled by the invisible tether of the voices.
He disappeared into the brush without a single sound, leaving the final two behind. They stood in the center of the clearing,
their breath visible in the cooling air, trembling as the silence reclaimed the woods. The forest was no longer just a place, it was a mouth, and it had swallowed three of them whole. They did not speak, they did not look back. The final two turned and ran, their boots hammering the soft, rot-filled earth. Branches whipped against their skin, leaving stinging welts, but they did not slow. The forest floor shifted, turning from moss to slick, unstable shale. One survivor stumbled, his hands clawing at the pine needles to haul himself back up, his fingernails caked with black dirt. He rose, gasping, his lungs burning with the sharp, thin air of the mountain. They sprinted blindly, pushing through a wall of dense, suffocating briars that tore at their limbs. Every movement was a struggle against the landscape itself. The mist clung to their faces, tasting of iron and decay. They scrambled up a steep, crumbling embankment. sliding back twice before finding purchase on a gnarled root. They hauled their weight upward, chests heaving, hearts drumming against their ribs like trapped birds. Ahead, the density of the trees began to break. A sliver of gray light sliced through the canopy. They lunged toward it, legs screaming with exhaustion, and burst through the final skeletal line of hemlocks. They hit the hard, uneven ground, their momentum carrying them out of the shadows and onto the edge of the road. The asphalt was cold and hard against their palms. They scrambled to their feet, their boots scraping against the grit of the road.
A low rumble vibrated through the ground as a sedan rounded the curve.
Its headlights cutting through the heavy fog, the survivors lunged into the center of the lane, waving their arms. Their mouths open in desperate, jagged gasps for help. The car did not brake. It did not swerve.
It passed within inches of them, the wind of its passage chilling their skin. Through the glass, the driver stared dead ahead,
eyes fixed on an invisible point beyond the windshield, completely unaware of the figures blocking the path. A second vehicle followed, then a third. Each car glided past with the same mechanical indifference.
The survivors sprinted to the yellow lines, throwing themselves into the path of a heavy truck, screaming until their throats burned raw. The driver remained motionless, hands locked on the wheel,
face devoid of any recognition. There was no honking, no flashing lights, no human reaction to their presence.
They stood in the middle of the empty lane, the roar of the engines fading into the distance,
leaving only the oppressive weight of the silence. The highway was a conduit for others, but for them, it was a wall of glass.
The road ahead stretched into a gray, featureless void. They turned their backs on the indifferent traffic, their shoulders slumping under the weight of the realization. The fog began to shift,
swirling in slow, heavy eddies around their ankles. Then, a dark, vertical shape pierced the gloom. It was a metal post, rusted and bent at a sharp angle. They walked toward it, their boots clicking hollowly against the pavement.
A rectangular slab of steel hung from the top, swinging slightly in the wind with a rhythmic,
metallic groan. The paint was peeling, revealing layers of oxidation beneath the letters.
As they drew closer, the words became clear in the dim, sickly light. Welcome to Hungry Ridge.
Population 5. The letters were stamped deep into the iron. The survivors stopped, their breath hitching in the cold air. They stood in the center of the lane, staring at the numbers.
Every muscle in their bodies locked in place. The sign did not look like a warning. It looked like a ledger.
They were not on a highway leading home. They were standing in the middle of a trap that had been waiting for their arrival for decades.
The silence of the road deepened, pressing against their ears like water.
They stood locked in a trance, eyes fixed on the rusted iron plate. The air grew thinner,
vibrating with a low-frequency hum that rattled their teeth. Then, the paint on the sign began to distort.
The digit 5 did not fade. It shuddered, its edges blurring like heat rising from a furnace. It blinked,
a stuttering spark of dying light, and snapped into the shape of a 4. The sound of the shift was like a bone snapping in a quiet room. The survivor to the left let out a sharp, jagged intake of breath.
But no sound followed. The space beside the final explorer collapsed. There was no struggle, no scream,
and no trail of movement. One moment, a presence stood there. The next, only a pocket of displaced air remained. The final explorer reached out, fingers grasping at empty space, but met only the damp, biting chill of the mountain fog. They spun around, searching the road, the tree line, and the dark gravel.
Nothing. The road was empty. The silence surged back, heavier than before, suffocating and absolute.
A single, rhythmic thud echoed from the forest, a soft, wet sound of chewing. The survivor stood motionless,
knees trembling, staring at the sign that now declared a population of 4. They were alone. The final explorer felt the weight of the camera pulling at their wrist, a heavy, useless burden.
Their fingers went slack. The device slipped, hitting the asphalt with a sharp, metallic crack that echoed against the silent mountain slopes. It skidded, coming to a rest at a slight angle. The lens remained intact,
aimed directly at the dark, jagged wall of the forest. Through the viewfinder, the trees appeared as towering, featureless silhouettes against the fading twilight. The autofocus pulsed, searching for a subject that did not exist.
There was no movement in the frame, no birds, no wind, only the static hum of the recording electronics.
The explorers stepped backward, their boots dragging through the loose gravel at the road's edge.
Each movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of urgency. They reached the tree line,
pausing for a single heartbeat, then pivoted into the thick, suffocating brush. The camera continued to record the empty road, the rusted sign, and the encroaching fog. The shutter clicked once,
a final mechanical gasp, as the last light of the day vanished behind the ridge. The frame darkened, losing all detail to the encroaching blackness, leaving the lens focused on the absolute, hungry silence of the woods. From the depth of the tree line, a new sound emerged. It was not wind or the settling of timber. It was a soft, rhythmic, collective noise. Hundreds of mouths, working in unison, chewing in the dark. The sound was wet, steady, and impossibly close. It filled the space between the trees.
A rhythmic grinding that vibrated through the asphalt and into the camera's frame. The hungry mountain had reached its capacity. The larder was sealed. Within the woods, the names carved into the hemlock wood settled into the grain, becoming part of the mountain's own architecture. The flickering sign on the roadside groaned, the rusted metal cooling in the night air. The number 4 blinked once, then faded completely, leaving only the bare, pitted iron. The silence of the forest was absolute again,
undisturbed by the struggle of the previous hours. Deep beneath the roots, where the air never moved and the soil never warmed, the secrets remained undisturbed. The camera lens,
caked in fine mountain dust, recorded only the encroaching fog. The feast had concluded.
The mountain waited for the next cycle to begin, its hunger momentarily sated by the shadows that had once been people.